Thank you very much, Kate, for inviting me once again to your wonderful university to present some of my ideas. Today, I am going to be presenting a paper that I wrote with Purushottama Villamoria in around 2015 and presented at a couple of conferences. It's called Advaita Vedanta and the Mind Extension Hypothesis. It's, for those of you who study philosophy of mind, you'll notice that the title is somewhat inverted version of the famous idea from David Chalmers and Andy Clark called the extended mind hypothesis. So there is a play on words here that's related to their work, and I'm going to be talking about their work. So the plan will be for me to sort of set up the initial part of the debate within analytic philosophy, and then I will slowly make a transition into a school of Indian philosophy known as Advaita Vedanta, and then I will show a specific type of mind extension hypothesis and how it's related to the extended mind hypothesis in analytic philosophy. And then, as usual, I'll raise some objections to my own position or the Advaita position and suggest that, just as you can find objections to the extended mind hypothesis by Clark and Chalmers, you can find objections to the mind extension hypothesis from Advaita Vedanta. Okay, so the place to begin that makes most sense to me is to talk about a form of contemporary materialism that basically accepts two ideas. The first idea I like to call promissory note physicalism. And the idea is that although we have to admit that we don't have a complete account of the nature of consciousness or all of our mental lives, it's going to turn out to be the case that that whole theory of how our mental life works and consciousness works is to be given in the scope of a physical theory, and that physics enough will be all we need in order to explain mental life across various species. It's important to recognize that promissory note physicalism, it's a concept to me that I'm also interested in independently, because it's related to these ideas about how do we make sense of what physicalists are really saying, because would the things that counted as being part of physical theory in, let's say, the time of Francis Bacon around the 1600s, would those things have included the kinds of things that Einstein posits in his theory? And so we know that physicalism is kind of like a moving target theory, because physics itself grows and expands. We basically know that what is going to count as being physical is going to change over time, and it's likely that it will. And so it could be the case that some of the things that now count as not being part of physical theory end up being part of physical theory because of this change in what counts as being physical. So promissory note physicalism is pretty much a theory that's saying, in some sense, though, we are entitled to still say physics will give us everything that we need to know about mental life in terms of explanation and ontology. And that's an interesting question. So Alyssa Nye has a view where she says physicalism really isn't about ontology alone. It's rather about an attitude. It's the attitude of the scientific method. It's basically saying that when you take on physicalism, you're taking on the attitude of scientific theorizing. So that switches it from being a theory of what are physical kinds of things and properties and how they come together to explain other things, to what is the attitude you take towards an inquiry in a domain. All right, so that's enough about problems. So that's one of the assumptions that's at play right now. Then another one is kind of a term that I made up, which is called the brain-body boundary condition. And the idea basically here is that when we want to explain things in terms of our mental life, we are only going to ever need to talk about things that are skin deep. That when we look to explain what's going on in our mental life, we don't really need to appeal to anything outside of the body, okay? So these are two assumptions that run through various forms of physicalism, and basically they kind of present a very strong thesis. They're basically saying that all we need to know is physics, and all we need to do is consider what's going on within the body. So if you're one of these people who is into 4E cognition, where we talk about the enacted mind, the extended mind, the environmental condition, and embodiment, you might think, okay, well, I don't think that my view of how physicalism plays out is captured well by this view, because I think there's more elements involved in giving a physical theory. That's fine. So I'm not trying to say that these two conditions are part and parcel of every account of physicalism. I'm saying, though, that in some sense, they are prominent enough to be picked out as mainstream forms of a view I call materialism. Okay, so there are two challenges to this. So the first challenge is a challenge to physicalism itself, the promissory note physicalism, and it's the idea that consciousness is basic and an intrinsic feature of the universe, and that it's ubiquitous, it's a fundamental property. So some people who hold this view basically think that if you look at what real physicalism is, what physicalism really is, physicalism just entails a version of panpsychism. The number one proponent of this view is Galen Strawson. So his view is basically that when you analyze what physicalism is, you're going to find out, because of the failure of macro-conscious states from micro-conscious, from non-conscious things, that a form of panpsychism that he calls micropsychism is going to be true. And the fundamental thesis there is that at least some of the fundamental elements of the universe are in themselves conscious. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to explain consciousness in creatures like us. So that's a challenge. On one reading of it, you could say, well, promissory note physicalism is wrong because panpsychism is true. And on another version, you can say that promissory note physicalism is sort of an empty view, because if something like panpsychism ends up being what's entailed by it, then we're sort of losing all sense of what we mean by physicalism, because we would have thought that the idea that panpsychism is part of physicalism is precisely the thing that's false. This is, again, this issue is bringing out the whole point of what I was sort of getting into in the last slide, which is that sometimes when we talk about physicalism, there's this problem with it being a moving target, or this idea that because it's incomplete, we're in a position to say anything about what a complete theory of mental life would look like on the basis of physics, when we don't really have the best story yet decided, or a complete theory that does a good enough job explaining simply what material objects are. We don't really have a complete theory of physics that we all agree upon that tells us exactly how matter behaves. We have different understandings and models of how to predict how matter will behave, but we don't have a deep explanatory model. Some people, such as Galen Strawson and other Indian thinkers, have even argued that the real problem that we have in the world is not what is the nature of consciousness, it's what is the nature of matter. Actually, matter is the thing that's hard to explain, not consciousness. Okay, then another thesis that challenges the other thing, the brain-body boundary condition, is the extended mind hypothesis, which basically says that it's possible for a constituent of the mind to not exist within the proper brain, body, skin deep aspect of the embodied human being. That is, part of my mind is something that's external to my body, and that challenges the idea that the brain-body boundary condition is essential to materialism. Okay, so these are the two ideas, 4 ideas. Promissory note physicalism is challenged by panpsychism, and the brain-body boundary condition is challenged by the extended mind hypothesis. Connection question. So is there some kind of way in which these two things are connected? Is the thesis that in some ways consciousness is fundamental in any way related to the idea that consciousness is not something, or sorry, the mental life is not something that is bound within the body, within the embodied creature? Now, in the next part of what I'm going to talk about, it is going to be clear that the answer to this question is no. That is, in analytical philosophy, I see little to no evidence that there has been an exploration of what, for example, would be the relationship between panpsychism and the extended mind hypothesis. And part of the reason why is because panpsychism is focusing on consciousness and the explanation of macro states of consciousness, and EMH is focusing on what it takes for something to be a constituent of a mind. So one is about consciousness per se, and the other one is about what is it to be a constituent of a given mind. So this issue, I haven't even really seen this question raised in the literature in Western philosophy. However, what I will say today is that even though this question isn't raised in Indian philosophy, no one actually writes the question this way, as you can see, there seems to be a definite connection between a version of the extended mind hypothesis called the mind extension hypothesis and a form of panpsychism in Advaita Vedanta. So that's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that actually this connection question, although not articulated in Indian philosophy, seems to be answered in a specific way. And it's worth understanding exactly where it's answered and how that's related to the view in analytic philosophy. Okay, so just real quickly, for the literature, the stuff that I've been sort of talking about that is really interesting to look at is basically, if you don't know, there's a very famous paper by David Chalmers and Andy Clark called The Extended Mind. And then a really good response to it is called The Bounds of Cognition. So those two papers kind of set up nicely what's going on in the analytic tradition. And then if you're interested in the stuff about physicalism and panpsychism, then the paper by Galen Strawson is really good. I'll be using some ideas from Zed Adams and Chauncey Maher. And then the other papers on the combination problem and the cosmopsychism are just about the nature of panpsychism. They're not specifically related to actually the arguments that I'm giving. Then in Indian philosophy, because we're using a cross-cultural methodology, it's important to look at the work of the Nyaya Sutras by Gautama Aksapada, the Vedanta Paribhasha, which is what I'm going to be using primarily, this paper by Purushottama Berlamura called Perception in Advaita Vedanta, and another one that he wrote called Jnana and Prama, The Logic of Knowing, a Critical Appraisal by Berlamura as well. Then there's some other papers and books on perception so you can understand in more detail what's going on in Indian philosophy in this area. But the main work that I'll be pulling from is the Vedanta Paribhasha, and in particular, the paper that Purushottama Berlamura wrote in 1981, where he sort of already kind of talks about the whole thing I'm going to argue about, but he doesn't really make the connections because at that time in 1980s, those connections were not there to be made actually in philosophy, because in analytic philosophy, the extended mind hypothesis had not been defended. Okay, so it just turns out that David Chalmers and Purushottama Berlamura met a long time ago at a conference. So all I'm doing is basically saying, Anand, since I study with both of these people, can you create a conversation between these two eminent philosophers from different traditions on this topic? And so in 2014, this was a task that was given to me, and lo and behold, I was able to do that, and that's the result of the paper that you have. So we're going to create a conversation. Okay, so one of the most important ways in which the extended mind hypothesis is argued for is through an example, and it's the example of Otto. So Otto has like Alzheimer's, and basically he wants to go to the museum in New York City. And what he does is he basically writes down in his book the address of a museum because he is trying to use the information that he can't remember in the book to remind him where he goes. And then the question is the information that he writes down in his book, in his notebook, a belief that is just stored outside of his brain, but because of how he uses it, it is a belief he has. So the example, in the way the paper is written, they actually compare Otto and Inga. So Inga is someone who doesn't have Alzheimer's, just remembers the address and goes to the location in New York by taking the right public transportation. And Otto has Alzheimer's, so he writes things down in his book. And then when he wants to get to the museum through public transportation, he looks up what the address is and uses it. So both of them have information, Inga and Otto. They both have the location of the museum, except they store it in different places. One stores it in a notebook and the other one stores it in their brain in memory. And then Andy Clark and David Chalmers are basically saying, well, I mean, they use it in the same way. They use it for the same purpose. So why is it the case that one of them has a belief, Inga, in her brain, and some people are inclined to say that the other person, Otto, doesn't have a belief and they're just stored in two different places? And so they say, insofar as information can be stored in various mediums, the book versus the brain, and used just as it would be used if it were stored in the brain, we have reason to hold that there is a functional equivalence, and thus the mind extends because a part of it is neither located where the brain is located, nor in the same medium as the brain. So this is the idea. The idea is that, look, part of my mind is not co-located with my brain. It's not temporally and spatially co-located with my brain. So nowadays it's easier to use, and Dave used to do this, use the example of an iPhone, right? How many of us rely on our iPhone because in some sense what we're doing is we're outsourcing our cognition. We're saying the task that I want to do is more like a decision-making task. And what I want the iPhone to do is all these other things like find the location, store the phone number of my friend, store the time when I have to show up at this meeting through a calendar function. And so we're outsourcing cognition, at least in the form of memories and beliefs. And then we're accessing them in the brain and deciding what to do. And so the extended mind hypothesis is just saying, well, why not just say that those things that are not spatially contiguous with our brain are still parts of our brain, much in the same way we might talk about something being a scattered object. So sometimes I used to think that the view of the extended mind is that basically what they're doing is they're defending the idea that the mind is a scattered object, the brain is not a scattered object, so the mind and the brain are not the same thing. That's basically the idea. Okay, so some clarifications. The extended mind hypothesis, strictly speaking, is a modal claim. It's a possibility claim. Given the way that the thesis is defended, it is possible that no one's mind is extended. And given how things could be, it is possible that everyone's mind is extended. So this is important because they're saying, given the fact that the medium of the notebook and the medium of the brain don't seem to be as important as the use of the information that's stored in these two different things, the extended mind hypothesis holds. But it could just turn out that, in fact, no one has an extended mind because there are other conditions which we all fail to have. And we'll get into what those could be in a minute. EMH is, it's more of a general claim about the mind. And in the particular case that Dave and Andy argue about it, they do it in terms of what's known as belief. So they want to take the mental state type belief, and they want to say that a belief is something for which the mind extends because it can be stored in a notebook or in a brain. So in that sense, the extended mind hypothesis really becomes the extended belief hypothesis, right? Because it's not really talking about all the other things. So if you want to say emotions extend, perception extends, if you want to say some other mental state type extends, you can do so, but you need to manufacture the argument for that, right? You need to argue that those other things can extend. They're just saying in their paper that belief extends, and because belief extends, we can say in general the mind extends. Okay, so the big problem that came out early on from Adams and Aizawa is basically called the coupling constitution fallacy. Now, the idea here is that when we look at the example, we don't need to ever talk about the mind extending, because we can just say that the mind has the capacity through the brain to couple, that is join, unify with a tool. So the notebook is a tool, the pen is a tool, and the mind, co-located with the brain, can join together with the tool to use it. So that's called coupling. And coupling is different than constitution. So constitution is the idea that the mind is in part constituted by something that's in the book. And the coupling part is the part that says, no, the mind isn't constituted by something in the book. The mind just through the brain couples with the book. It joins with the book. So Adams and Aizawa argue that there is no extended mind at all. There's a fallacy here. The idea is that Dave and Andy have argued on the basis that the mind can couple with something external to it, that it's constituted by this thing external to it. But you don't have to say that it's constituted. You can just say that it couples. So they ask, why doesn't Otto's mind simply couple with the notebook? Why does Otto's mind have to be partly constituted by the information in the notebook? Why does the notebook information have to be part of the mind as opposed to a tool that's used by the mind, right? So just as I can use a hammer without the hammer becoming part of me, I can use a notebook for a useful purpose without it becoming part of me. That's the basic response to the extended mind hypothesis. So, so these other two scholars, Zed Adams and Chauncey Maher, they sort of have a response to this objection that I really like. It's a good response. And they basically want to say, there really isn't a coupling constitution fallacy at all. And here's basically their argument. Y is part of a cognitive system Z. X, an external item, has the same high bandwidth interaction with other parts of Z that Y has. Therefore, X is functionally equivalent to Y. Therefore, X is part of Z. So this is sort of the template that they think is going on when you're arguing for the extended mind hypothesis. So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to say, what is really going on when someone argues for the extended mind hypothesis, such as Chalmers and Clark? This is their version of the argument given on the basis of the example of comparing Otto and Inga. And now they're going to say that there's a way to see how the coupling constitution fallacy doesn't apply. And the key idea is this. The entity external to the agent and the agent form a system together. Okay, so let A be the agent. Their idea is that A plus X equals Z because A plus Y equals Z, and X and Y are functionally equivalent, right? So what they're going to do is they're going to try and say, the reason why there isn't a fallacy is because the people who run the coupling constitution fallacy have not recognized what is the system that we're talking about. So when they say coupling versus constitution, they're saying the mind is one system and it's coupling to the notebook, which is another system, just as the mind is one system, couples with a hammer. They're saying the coupling occurs between two systems that are independent, And they're now going to say that's incorrect. The way the argument is really working is that the two things form one system. The notebook and the brain inside together are forming one system. They're not two systems that are joined together. They're one system formed through these two parts interacting. That's the system. It's not the notebook system and the mind system coming together. If it was the notebook and the mind system coming together, that would be coupling. But if it's two independent things that form a system together, then there's only one system. If there's only one system, there is no fallacy. There's no way to say there's a coupling constitution fallacy. So they're going to defend that. Now, how are they going to defend it? They're going to defend it by saying what are the conditions under which a system is formed. So first condition is called system condition. On theory of mind M, mental state type T can involve mind extension beyond the brain-body boundary only if on M, T is articulated so as not to involve mere causal interaction, but instead to form a genuine system that involves body internal elements and body external elements, right? So the point of this condition is that the idea is that all the stuff internal to us is not just causally interacting with the notebook, but is forming a new system with the notebook as part. That's the key idea. So the idea is that you don't have two systems joining together through mere causal interaction. You have instead two parts coming together to form a new system. That's the key idea. So it's mere causal interaction between one system and something else, or two things coming together to form one system. And that's what the system condition says. Okay. Then they give a responsibility condition. They say a system must take responsibility for the proper functioning of its semantic activity, for that semantic activity to exhibit original intentionality. By this, we mean that it must be critical of its semantic activity. So what do they mean by it must be critical of its semantic activity? It must follow norms for producing, manipulating, and removing semantic items. So for example, if Otto woke up and realized that his brother was messing with his notebook, he would have to go back in and check the details of his notebook. He'd be like, oh, okay, something's wrong with it. I need to go fix the notebook because my brother messed around with it. It scrutinized norms for producing, manipulating, and removing semantic items. That means it must consider what's the right way to update the notebook. And it must ultimately care about getting things right, because ultimately Otto wants to get to the museum. So it has to have some concern for the truth. So the two conditions that Adams and Maher argue for that stop or block the coupling constitution fallacy are the system condition and the responsibility condition. And what they're basically saying is that the two parts come together and exhibit original intentionality as opposed to derived intentionality, because there isn't mere causal interaction, and there's also responsibility within the system to get things right, basically, and to follow norms for critically engaging with the notebook. Okay, now you might think, I don't think these conditions do anything. I think the coupling constitution fallacy still holds. But for the purposes of trying to find a pathway from analytical philosophy to Indian philosophy, I found this work very insightful, actually, and I used it to create a pathway. So now let's go to looking at how to get to Indian philosophy. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the two conditions apart. That is, I'm going to say that of the things that they have said in blocking the coupling constitution fallacy, the system condition seems to me something you have to accept, right? And why? Because the system condition is really basic. It's just saying, look, there are two ways to analyze things. Method number one, we can analyze things by saying that there are two systems that couple together, or there are two parts or entities that form a new system. And the system condition is saying when we don't have mere causal interaction, we have reason to believe that two things are coming together to form a new system. And that's really what's needed. to block the coupling constitution fallacy, you need to simply identify a mechanism under which you can say that the brain and the notebook are forming a new system called the brain plus the notebook, right? That's what you really need to say, right? And so the system condition is really important. Now, the responsibility condition to me is not important. And the reason why is because of what I said earlier. The responsibility condition is something that is tied to the kind of content that a belief has. A belief has propositional content, and that propositional content is subject to norms for belief revision, and it's something that's subject to the general idea of getting things right. Now, if we want to generalize the extended mind hypothesis away from belief, it would seem to me that we would want to accept the system condition, but we might not want to accept the responsibility condition. Why? Because the system condition is general enough to block the relationship between coupling and constitution as a fallacy, but the responsibility condition is too specific to the type of content that beliefs have. So I'm not sure that in going forward, we need to accept the responsibility condition. That doesn't mean it can't turn out to be true. It just means that the main thing we have to block is coupling and constitution as a fallacy. And the thing that does that is noticing that two things can come together to form a system, which is what the system condition tells us. So as we get into Indian philosophy, I'm going to say that we are basically going to accept the system condition and drop the responsibility condition, because we are now no longer looking for the extended mind hypothesis in the case of belief, but we're looking at the extended mind hypothesis in terms of other mental state types. Got it? Okay. So here are some things that are in general important between Indian philosophy and Anglo-analytic philosophy. So in Indian philosophy, the area in which we study epistemology is called Pramana Shastra. And an epistemology in the analytic tradition is the word that's related to ancient Greek philosophy, to episteme. So some of the things that are interesting, it's common in analytical philosophy, at least, I don't know, I would say over the last, at least before, from 1900 to 2000, I'd say, it's common to look at what's known as a decompositional account of knowledge. Decompositional means that knowledge itself has parts. So arguably, Plato said that knowledge is justified true belief. That means knowledge has three parts: justification, truth, and belief. It's not so clear that Indian philosophers accept the idea that knowledge is decompositional, or at least some of them. I just wrote another follow-up paper where I argued that there's at least one philosopher in India who does not think that knowledge is decompositional. Second, it's not clear in any of the traditions that justification, as we understand it in the internalist idea that is prominent in Plato and Descartes and lots of analytic philosophy, that justification is a component of knowledge, okay? But that's common in analytic philosophy. It's also very important that in various schools of Indian philosophy, many of them, that we understand knowledge as thematized around its relationship to action. That a lot of these schools think that the only way to explain why we have unhesitating action in the world is because knowledge is guiding us. So knowledge, especially in the Nyaya tradition, is tied very strongly to explaining action. Knowledge and action go together. It's not clear in a lot of the work you read in analytic philosophy and epistemology that knowledge and action are tied this way. Of course, there are people who can make this point. I was reading a book recently on perception where someone made this point quite vehemently, but it's not a central theme. But I would say that an ongoing demand in Indian philosophy is that if you're talking about knowledge, it better be because you think it can explain something that's important in the space of action, of how we act. So there's like a behavioral component explaining action that knowledge it has a demand on. And then it's very common in Indian philosophy to see knowledge construed on an externalist model where someone can know something without knowing that they know it. So internalism basically accepts the thesis that if you know something, you know that you know it. And it looks like the externalists sort of deny that. Externalism is common in Indian epistemology. It's debated still in contemporary epistemology. So those are just some superficial structural differences. And actually already here, you might see why I dropped the responsibility condition. The responsibility condition largely seems to flow from a Western epistemological approach that adopts internalism as its sort of basic way of thinking about the nature of knowledge. So it seems to me that if we're going to look for this thesis in other areas, we have to drop this assumption about internalism. And because externalism is more common, we need to drop the responsibility condition, since externalism is more common in the Indian tradition. So that's another reason why I dropped the responsibility condition. But I want to make it clear, the main point is that the responsibility condition seems to be appropriate for certain mental state types. It doesn't seem to be like the system condition, generic across many different mental state types. Okay, so now let's look at what some Indian philosophers say. Okay, so this is from a book called Vedanta Paribhasha. It's pretty much one of the key epistemological texts of the Vedanta tradition, especially the Advaita tradition. So now we're reading, I'm just pulling something out, so I have to give you the context. So there is what is called a Purvapakshin, someone who is a opponent of the view being explored. And then there's the person who's a proponent. And so the Purvapakshin is raising this objection or this question. What then is the criterion of perception according to the tenets of Vedanta? That is sort of saying, like in a Socratic voice, what's the definition, the real definition, not the conceptual definition, what's the real definition of perception? And then the proponent of the school writes this: do you inquire about the criterion of the perception of knowledge or of the objects? If it be the former, perception of knowledge, we say it is the unity of the consciousness reflected in the means of knowledge with the consciousness limited by the object. To be explicit, consciousness is threefold, as associated with the object, with the means of knowledge, and with the subject or knower. Of these, consciousness limited by a jar is the consciousness associated with the means of knowledge. And that limited by the mind is the consciousness with the subject. So this is sort of saying that we have a threefold structure, and when we want to limit it into subject and object, we split it along two of the dimensions, right? One set of dimensions that are two takes it to the subject pole, and another set of the dimensions, the means and the object, take it towards the object pole, right? But what we're doing is we're superimposing a structure onto what is actually going on in the world. I mean, we are basically making a conceptual division. So he continues. The luminous mind, that means the phenomenal consciousness of the mind, the luminous, the light aspect of the mind, issuing through the medium of the eye, goes to the space occupied by objects such as a jar and is modified into the form of a jar or any other object. That very modification is called a state. But in the case of inference, the mind does not go to the space occupied by the fire, for the latter are not in contact with the eye. Thus, in the case of perception, such as this jar, the jar and the mental state in the form of those combine in the same place outside the body, and hence the consciousness limited by both is one and the same. For the mental state and objects such as a jar, although they are dividing factors, do not here produce any difference, since they occupy the same space. In the case of perception of a jar as this jar, the mental state with the form of the jar being in contact with it, the consciousness limited by the mental state is not different from the consciousness limited by the jar. And hence, in the knowledge of the jar, there is a perception so far as the jar is concerned. So there's a lot going on here. I will just take out three different things. One, this is what we call a contrastive account of a way of knowing. So they're saying when you infer something, you don't have what's going on when you perceive something. That's one thing that's going on here. They're contrasting perceiving the jar versus inferring the jar. Number two, in the highlighted section in italics, you can clearly see that they see something going on outside of the body. They're not seeing it in here, they're seeing it out there. Okay. And then they're saying something about a unification of consciousness between the subject pole, perception as the means of knowing, and the object pole. So they're seeing it sort of like all of a sudden what happens when you perceive something is there's a system that forms between you as the subject on one side and the object on the other side through the means of perceiving. However, when they say that the system forms by the subject, the means of perceive, the means of knowing, perception, and the object, they mean those as merely conceptual things that we say. They don't think in actual reality those things are the parts that are going on. They think what's happening is sort of like at the moment you see, for example, a single object, a system forms between you and the object. Okay. And so, and they want to capture that through the idea that the mind extends out to the object, but not in terms of something like physical contact, like touching the object, because the nature of the mind is the nature of light, right? So the way in which light interacts with an object is not the same as when you touch an object, right? Because when you touch an object, there are certain aspects of the physics of touch that are absent in the way in which light, for example, illuminates something. So they do think that the mind is going out to the object and forming a system, but I don't think it's doing it in the touching sense. They think it's doing it in an illumination sense. Okay. So, so in 1980, Purushottam Villamoria wrote this when he wrote a paper on this. He said, Manas, which can be more or less rendered as mind, is an important faculty postulated in Advaitic theory. Manas is not a sense organ, Indriya. Manas is not an independent reality existing outside the subjective whole. Advaita regards Manas to be part of a complex, unified inner organ, which is termed antakarana, literally inner vehicle. Antakarana is described by Madhusudana Saraswati as being composed of 5 subtle elements, tanmatras, namely the subtle essence of earth, water, air, fire, and ether, akasha, with the predominance of the latter over the former. Antakarana is of light nature and having therein at the same time the predominance of the sattva guna, lightness, tendency, being extremely clear like a mirror, is capable of flowing out through the senses, and like the solar light, it is capable of speedily contracting and expanding. The antakarana, unlike the mind of Locke, is not a passive recipient of data. It is an active instrument in the process of perception. So for those of you who remember Locke's theory of mind, which Kant himself critiqued as being overly passive, right, in the Western tradition, Purushottam Villamoria is just pointing out, well, that's exactly what's going on here. The Advaitins are basically saying, no, you don't sit there having things slam the tabula rasa. That's not what's going on at all. What's going on is there's an active engagement in perception with the world. Now, the active engagement that Kant was going for was like the unity of apperception or something like that, or the combination of intuitions and concepts in making conscious experience. That's not what's going on here, but in some sense, the Vedantic tradition here is sharing something with the Kantian theory of mind insofar as its critique of the Lockean passive sort of conception of the mind. And so that's what's being emphasized here. Okay, so the key elements are this. AVM stands for Advaita Vedanta theory of mind. Posits a faculty that is an inner organ, manas. The inner organ is not a sense organ such as an eye. The inner organ has the capacity to go out through the sense organs. Okay, and the fact that the inner organ can go out allows the mind to be the fact that the inner organ can go out allows the mind to be active in its relation to the world as opposed to being merely passive. So again, the thing that I just want to emphasize here is that the idea of what's being emphasized here has more to do with the passive active distinction and then how it's explained. So the activity of the mind is to be explained by the mind literally going out in the world and doing something. Right, that's the key element here that's going on. But again, you don't need to see this in terms of something like you don't need to see it in terms of let's see, what would I say? You don't need to see it in terms of touching or grabbing. That's not the only way you can see it. You need to see it in terms of illuminating. Okay, so okay, 5. So they also say perception as a means to knowledge of a jar involves threefold consciousness: subject, instrument, object. That's what I went through. Part 1, a subject's consciousness being limited by a jar is the consciousness associated with perception as an instrument of knowing. Part 2, a subject's consciousness being limited by the mind is the consciousness associated with the subject. So you see what's happening is that there's 3 things. If you take one grouping, subject and instrument, you get the subject pole. And if you take instrument and object, you get the object pole. But those are conceptual ways of cutting up the thing. But in reality, it's just one system. Okay, so the main argument that I developed for their view is this. The mind modified by the jar external to the body equals M. The jar external to the body equals J. The consciousness of the subject is limited by the jar external to the body, and the mind modified by the jar external to the body equals C. M plus J equals C. Since C is a new system composed of differential parts, M and J does not merely causally influence M. Therefore, mental state C meets the system condition for mind extension. So what I did was I took the system condition from Adams and Marr that they used to block the coupling constitution fallacy. Then I showed that according to the Advaita Vedanta theory of mind, in perception, there are these 2 parts that come together and are unified, and therefore they meet the system condition. It's not causal influence alone, it's a combined system. So in the case of perception, on their view, because the mind is going out literally and illuminating, there is a sense in which there is a unified system, and therefore the mind extends in some way. So in order to make things clear, as I wrote in the paper, David Chalmers and Andy Clark are defending the extended mind hypothesis, and I think that the Advaita Vedanta school is defending the mind extension hypothesis. Subtle difference: extended mind, mind extension. Okay, so here are some big differences. Chalmers and Clark work on a functionalist background theory. Advaita Vedanta has some form of panpsychism. I'm not going to talk about that. That's in my paper, actually, but I'm not going to talk about that now. But in general, that was the point of departure, was what's the relationship between extended mind, mind extension, and panpsychism? Well, one difference is this, is that because Chalmers and Clark are functionalists, they probably find it more plausible to go in for the extended mind hypothesis, while Advaita Vedanta, being panpsychist, think it's better to go in for the mind extension hypothesis. Okay, Chalmers and Clark defended for belief, Advaita for perception. Epistemology for Chalmers and Clark will follow the responsibility-based account that Chalmers and Maher and Adams argued for. Advaita Vedanta is concerned about knowledge. And of course, the difference also is that the extended mind hypothesis involves non-continuous part extension. So the notebook is not a continuous part of my mind. It's a non-continuous part of my mind. And the mind extension hypothesis is continuous part extension. So a part of my mind has a continuous connection to the internal part, goes out and forms a system with an object out there. So that's continuous part extension versus non-continuous part extension. Functionalism goes with non-continuous part extension, and panpsychism goes with continuous part extension. Okay, now every theory has objections. So Advaita Vedanta has some problems too from modern science. Extended perception faces the distance problem. How can we make sense of the idea that in perception of, say, the sun, the mind extends out to the entity to form a unified system? How can the mind travel so far so quickly? So this I mean, the most basic and naive view of perceptual processing, not the epistemology of perception, is going to tell us that light hitting our retina is an essential, if not like a necessary condition of conscious perception. So how does this theory make any sense in terms of modern science? I mean, isn't it just clearly false that our mind does go out and make a connection with distant objects? So the mind extension hypothesis depends on the idea that we can make sense of the mind extending out of the body in a way that allows us to make sense of it forming a system with an object of perception. There's no way in which we can make sense of the mind extending out of the body instantaneously to an object of perception that is far away, such as the sun. So the mind extension hypothesis, though coherent, is not plausible until there's a model of the mind under which we can make sense of it extending out. I'll actually answer how it does that, but I wanted to make it clear what the objection is. So you know, from a scientific point of view, that goes as far back as at least the mid-1800s, this is what the objection would be. Another version comes from a famous argument in the 20th century known as the time lag. I forgot who gave this argument, but it's a very famous argument in the philosophy of perception. Perception is dependent on information about the external world reaching the sensory areas of the brain via the sense organs and then being processed there, all of which does not happen instantaneously, but takes at least around 1/10 of a second. Therefore, what one experiences perceptually must lag behind the external world by at least around 1/10 of a second. If X and Y are actually literally the same thing, then there cannot be any kind of distinction whatsoever, how small, between X and Y. Therefore, what one experiences perceptually cannot literally be the area of the external world being perceived. Therefore, what one experiences perceptually must be a delayed representation of the area of the external world being perceived, generated by the brain from sensory information. Therefore, perception is merely a mental simulation of the external world. So this is the idea that this view can't make sense because there's a time lag in perceptual processing, and this is trying to tell us that there's a connection in a unified single system. And so there's a problem here. So the problem, one is distance, and number two is time lag. How does this theory make sense of distance and time lag? Okay, so those are the two objections. And maybe I'll just go back and say something real quickly here. So these aren't, so people ask me, why did you stop working on this some 8 years ago, I guess? And the answer is I ran into both of these problems and I couldn't think of a good way to answer them. But now I basically have something like an idea of like how I would answer them. So the distance problem basically is focused on an idea that we can push back on if we can make sense of one thing. It seems to me like certain classical Indian theories of perception are consistent with the idea that the mind can engage in quantum entanglement with distant objects. So we already know that there's a phenomenon of spooky action at a distance where particles can be entangled and instantaneously over very, very large distances seem to be affecting each other causally, but without contact. Okay, so remember I told you that the extended mind hypothesis, that the mind extension is not a theory of touching an object with the mind. It's not like you're saying that the mind goes out and touches it with the hand metaphor. That's not what they're saying. It's an illumination idea. So if the illumination idea can be made to make sense as a way in which the mind can become quantumly entangled with objects and properties in your perceptual field that the retina is facilitating, that would be the ideal way to go. How plausible that is, I don't know. That's way above my pay grade, but it's at least not as implausible as one might think initially, because there are serious studies of quantum entanglement, and there are serious understandings of how it works and the importance of positing it as a phenomenon to make sense of other things in physics. And in addition, there's a lot of stuff about the deep complexity of our brains that we don't understand. If our brains themselves are quantum computers of a certain kind, then it's not implausible to think that it can become quantumly entangled with a distant object. So the distance problem is not really a problem to me if quantum entanglement between the brain and distant objects can be made sense of. There are some other things that can be said here, but at least this is the way that I find most plausible to respond to this. And by the way, this issue comes up in other Indian philosophical traditions. It seems like a lot of them had something where they must have thought something like quantum entanglement had to be possible, because a lot of their theories just seem to assume that without that possibility, their theory would not work at all. All right. So time lag itself is an interesting thing, but the thing that is problematic here is that time lag occurs itself within any system. So this isn't a specific problem for perception lagging behind reality unless we force the problem out a certain way. Anything that processes information does so in time. And because it does so in time, the relationship between its inputs and its outputs will not be veridical temporally. That is, something that was an input at one point, by the time it's processed in the system, may no longer be an input that exists even at all. So temperature variation is a good example of that, right? So when the thermometer in real time picks up the initial temperature of the room as it's rising, by the time it's processed that information and registered what the temperature is, it's no longer that temperature, but the temperature is rising, right? So within that system, we already understand this idea of time lag within the system. So the real issue is that the time lag here would mean that we are not getting things right in perception because there's a lag. And because of the lag, we can't know for sure what's going on now through perception. We can't understand what's going on now through perception because all perception takes time. And because it takes time, what's happening now might not be what it seems like in conscious perception once we become conscious of it. That's okay. Because the difference between getting things right and being able to act on the basis of them is all that this tradition and most Indian traditions are focused on. They are not focused in the case of perception on getting things right. They're focused on being able to act. And you can surely be able to act coherently and adequately in your environment, even if there is time lag, right? So time lag doesn't mean that the actions that I choose to do on the basis of what I perceive won't work. It means that they might not be completely accurate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was really, I think, explicit and, well, challenging presentation. Challenging in terms of how to find, immediate probably questioning, but still, I hope that there could be some questions from our audience, maybe. So you could either raise hand or just write down your questions into the chat or just speak as you wish. Well, so far, to me, there's still one big issue is the issue of differentiation between perception and knowledge then.
Okay, so can you explain the question in more detail?
Yeah, if I would give it in more details, I would say that, well, if we consider the possibility for someone in Advaita, as far as I'm concerned, to be capable of having knowledge and not being reflective about it, whether it's correct, right? And also the other condition is also to have knowledge and don't analyze it into going into details, not have an elementary structure of knowledge. Then it seems that the differentiation between having like a clear perception and having knowledge is not really evident to me. So do we need this differentiation then?
Okay, so good. So there's definitely an issue here about the relationship between knowledge and perception. So the interesting thing here for me, Kate, is that the paper that I wrote recently about a different school of philosophy in the 14th century is directly related to this question. What's the relationship between perceiving and knowing? And in that paper, I lay out another theory and I say how they answer exactly this question. But for this tradition, I can only hypothesize because I haven't done my homework about what they actually say beyond this thing. But I can hypothesize some sorts of things. And the answer is sort of in a slide I gave before where I compared what goes on in the high level of generality in Indian epistemology versus like most Western epistemology. So one of the things that's going on here that is going to make this, so your question is good in the sense that, well, okay, so we have a theory now of perception, but how does that correlate to the theory that perception gives us knowledge, right? Right, so that's exactly right. So on one sort of theory, in general, not in Indian philosophy or analysis, just in general, just doing general epistemology across traditions, the way in which any sensory apparatus plays a role in the acquisition of knowledge is through what's known as the basing relation. So the idea is that someone would say, testimony is a basis for knowing. Perception is a basis for knowing. Inference is a basis for knowing. And in here, what we're saying is either the sensory system, perceiving, or the kind of evidence given in terms of what it is, testimony versus inference, or a process, is a basis for knowing. But what happens is that these things are bases, and then other things have to happen, and then you end up with knowledge. So this picture is what we might call first of all, it is a compositional account of knowledge. It's saying knowledge is composed of parts, one of which is what is the basis of the knowledge, right? So perception is a basis for knowing. So perception is a component along with other things that get you to the knowledge. Okay, so that's one model. And I'm actually working on a paper this year where I'm exploring why I think that whole general structure can be argued against through the opponent model. The opponent model says, in some cases, in fact, perception is not a basis for knowing. The perceptual state is the knowledge itself. It's not a basis for it, okay? So in the paper I did write on elements of knowledge first in Gangesha, just published this year, in that paper, I argued that there is one specific philosopher in one tradition who defended exactly this view. He defended the view that states of perception are directly states of knowing. They're not a basis for knowing, right? That doesn't mean that every type of perception is a basis for knowing. It just means that there are cases where it's going to go that way. And so the general idea would be, if there is some similarity between the Navya Nyaya school on this point and this specific text, the Vedanta Paribhasha, which I probably think there is, now that I think about it, it's not too hard to think that many of these people might have just thought basing is not what's going on. So they would have been like, no, if I perceive it under the right conditions, then it's going to be the case that my perception is an episode of knowledge. And the reason why is because in Indian philosophy, we oftentimes talk about knowledge episodically, in the sense that I'm having an episode of knowing now, but now I'm not having an episode of knowing because these objective conditions have not been fulfilled. So that's the first part. And then the second part has to do with the thing about getting things right. The important thing that's the explanatory demand in many of these Indian theories is that your episode of perceiving, that is one and the same an episode of knowing, it's not a basis for knowing, should be able to play a role in explaining why you had successful action in the world. So the explanatory demand isn't the absolute truth. The explanatory demand is successful action, right? So in some sense, they like now it's very hypothetical. This is not textual. This is me sort of speaking, probably because I believe this view, but speaking through them. Please don't say it's nothing I've read in a text. But they might be thinking, if perception is the basis for knowledge, and knowledge is a necessary condition or an important condition in cases of successful action, then that whole process is too slow. It's only because perception is directly a way of knowing that then we can act in a successful way without hesitation. That's the idea. So the explanation is successful action, and you didn't hesitate. Why? Because you knew. Why did you know? Because the perception itself was the knowledge. There was no process where it had to be composed with other things to then get it to be knowledge, so then you acted. It isn't like I perceive, put something together called knowledge, and then I act. That's way too slow. It's rather you perceive, the perception is a knowledge because objective conditions completely independent of your knowledge have been satisfied between your mind and the world, such as in the Vedanta tradition, forming a system with the object, and the Nyaya tradition satisfying 9 conditions of positive and negative causal conditions on perception. That's a different theory, but the idea is the same. Perception isn't the basis. Perception is directly the knowledge, and the knowledge then, because it's direct, can explain unhesitating successful action. That is what I think they would say. So there's a little bit of this different, where like in the Platonic sense, when you're searching for knowledge, you're searching for like, what is the absolute truth, right? Here the focus is, no, they have like spiritual and other forms of knowledge for getting at stuff like that. That's all based in meditation and stuff like that. So perception's not going to do that for you. Perception isn't the thing for that. Perception is supposed to explain how you acted successfully without hesitating. And guess what? It can do that just fine without getting things exactly right, as long as it gets them right relative to the purpose for which you would be doing something. That, I think, is what they're going for. So again, Kate, I'm not sure exactly that, like, that's an answer that requires a lot of argumentation. So that's why I'm working on another paper about these two models. One is the basing plus composition, and the other one is the non-basing, non-composition view. That's the two different views. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have also a continuation, but first I would like to pass questioning to further.
Hello, thank you, Kate.
Hello.
I would like to add another question in the same lane, so to speak. I didn't notice a difference between a perception of a physical object and a concept. For example, we have a concept of a jar, and we have a jar itself, physical object. So I understand that the mind, yes, it can extend through perception to the specific physical jar. It's okay, no problem. But where is the place of the concept itself? How mind can extend to the concept? And how we can have a knowledge of the concept in this scheme of things? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I know here textually that's relevant, so there's a common distinction that is made in many schools of Indian philosophy. So again, I'm not answering specifically for this tradition. I'm giving you sort of the outline of a general way of thinking. This thing that I'm going to talk about actually is probably one of the most common ideas found in phenomenology, analytic philosophy, continental philosophy. And Western philosophers talk about this too, but Indian philosophers talk about it in a slightly different way. So the distinction is between nirvikapalka pratyaksha and savikapalka pratyaksha. So that what they're saying is that there are two types of perception. And now when we translate into English, the easiest way to say it is there is a type of perception that is free of concepts, and there is a type of perception that is conceptually loaded. Okay, so nirvikapalka pratyaksha roughly means without concepts, and then savikapalka means with concepts. The problem is that if you know any of the literature in Western philosophy, as soon as you say it in English, it's like, well, what kind of concepts are you talking about? Well, how do they combine? Well, what is the perceptual concept? There's a massive industry of over 1,000 papers in the last 100 years written on this topic, and I worked on it too myself. So I know how difficult it can be. But I would think in some sense that on this view, the idea is that the kind of perceptual contact because it's illumination actually, that's being made is at the non-conceptual level. And the system is formed at a non-conceptual level, and that non-conceptual formation of a system then plays a role in feeding the higher order levels of the system, so that conceptual stuff can be overlaid on top of it. So typically, just like not all Western philosophers go this way, but we sometimes say like epistemology happens at the level of conceptual perception, not non-conceptual perception. And I think some of the Indian philosophers are going to be very inclined to say that. And it's related kind of also to what Kate is talking about in terms of the relationship between perception and knowledge. Because if the epistemology of perception is at the conceptual level, but the connection is at the non-conceptual level, then there's a question again, how does the perception connect with the making of the knowledge, especially in the direct sense? I don't think that this is going to be actually a problem. I think it's a question to be answered. So to fully answer Kate's question, I don't think it's going to be a problem though. I don't think there's a problem here at all about the two levels, because this is exactly what happens in any complex system where one part of the system is cordoned off from the rest of the system while it processes input of one kind before it sends it to another part of the system. So, I mean, complex systems theory would seem to suggest to me just naively that this is probably happening all the time in complex systems. So what we're saying is that the unity of the object and the brain through continuous part extension of the mind through illumination is operating at one level, while in real time at another level, that information is being fed up to a conceptually loaded level where we have conceptual perception, like seeing a jar as opposed to seeing that in the distance. And then action is done on the basis of it. But in neither of these cases, this is the important thing, is the relationship between the non-conceptual system connection between the object and the subject via illumination and perception of mind extension, a basing relation for the conceptual stuff. It's not like it's working that way. That's the important thing, is there a basing relation going on there? And so as long as it's not a basing relationship, I don't perceive it's going to be a problem. It's more of a question of how do you work out the details of one system connection helping another system connection put something together so that you can go do something without hesitating in the world. That's what I would think is the answer. I hope that helps, but I don't textually, I stopped looking at a lot of the textual material in this tradition for recently because I've been working on the other tradition, the Navya Nyaya. So this is the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and I also work on the Navya Nyaya tradition. I have a lot more to say about how the Navya version of this whole story works. I think it's also a bit more plausible. But one thing I wanted to say in terms of this view is that I'm not sure that the time lag problem and the distance problem are really as serious as I thought like 6 years ago when I first realized, like, oh my God, there's no point working on this. Now I'm more concerned with like just how does this story unfold in the way in which, like, sort of I was just answering, like, how do we make sense of this leading to successful action without hesitation on the basis of knowledge, and this connection being there and it feeding the system for conceptual stuff? Because I mean, they're not denying that you see the jar conceptually. They're definitely not. So that's, they did draw this distinction. So that's my initial answer. Sorry, I hope that was helpful to a certain degree. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like just to add one thing. So in a sense, we can say that these concepts are like inside the mind, since we talk about extension. So there is like this inner place of the mind with concepts and outer place of physical objects. Can we say like that?
You can definitely say the inside outside thing, but one thing I do think is also worth picking out now that you've pushed on the concept thing again. Some of the ways in which we talk about concepts in contemporary or 20th century analytic philosophy, it just isn't an idea that Indian, like the Frege idea of what a concept is. If you're familiar with Gottlob Frege, this is just not an idea Indian philosophers explored ever. And I think they would find it completely odd and foreign and just not interesting at all. If anything, concepts might be more like habits of categorization, like in terms of their operational functioning. Like you can find a division between nominalists and realists about concepts in Indian philosophy. Buddhists tend to be nominalists. Navya and Nyayikas tend to be realists of various kinds. And they also have differences between accepting trope theories and all sorts. So that kind of debate is there. But the idea of a concept as an abstract object that's not in the spatial temporal world, that somehow we connect through intuition directly, that's just really not going on. So I don't think that component is going to show up. They're going to say, yeah, concepts are inside the mind in the sense that whatever makes a habit happen has to be internal, because volition is internal and the object is out there. So the perceptual system through vision puts you in illumination contact with an object out there. And then the habits of your mind, given part of what's illuminated through contact, is then applied to the object. I think they would go more with a habit-oriented view. If you look inside so it's difficult here because now we're mixing between these different kinds of schools. Like a Buddhist tradition is more likely to have this habits view. I'm not sure that the Vedanta people would accept it exactly the way I've said it. But the reason why I feel okay saying it is because the Vedanta school, just like the Buddhist school, thinks there are various different levels of existence, right? And so they think that the types of stuff we are talking about already exist in a plane of existence, the ordinary world, for which real ultimate truth, getting things absolutely right, doesn't make as much sense as the habits that we use to navigate our reality in a way that can explain unhesitating action through knowledge. So they are okay saying, oh, well, there's a different type of knowledge that's deeply spiritual, requires inward reflection and millennial of meditation to get through. It's a higher understanding and knowledge of the ultimate reality. But that isn't this. This isn't going to do that for you. This is going to help you get to the museum like Otto. And so let's explain how that works. And then let's not try to say that there's a common kind of knowledge between these two, because these aren't really common kinds of knowledge. They are just things that have the same epistemic status as being knowledge as opposed to belief or understanding or some other epistemic state. But the kind of thing they are is much different, because the kind of thing they're directed at or about and their significance is much different. Like the type of perceptual action, the perception that they're talking about should explain your ordinary behavior in terms of successful action. It shouldn't explain spiritual truth, right? But then they'll say, but we have a whole 1,000-page book just on that one. In case you're worried about that one, we can go tell you about that one. It's just that these two things aren't the same. So in Western epistemology, we have tended, in a lot of cases, to accept what's kind of known as the thesis that they're the single kind account of knowledge, where it's like we look at linguistics in English, for example, and we say, look, there's just one kind of knowledge, right? Just like, you can talk about knowledge that's based on different things. You can talk about knowledge that's about different things, but the K, the knowledge, that's all the same, right? Now, there are people who will obviously disagree with this, like Ernie Souza talks about reflective versus animal knowledge, and some other people talk about different kinds of knowledge, like you can read it in Plotinus, for example. But there's a lot of people who go in for this single tier view. In Indian philosophy, it's almost all multiple tiers. It's like low, medium, high, super high, or it's like ultimate versus practical. They're always doing it in terms of tiers. And those tiers aren't just about the object, like the kind of thing that's known. That would be the Western way of doing it, saying, oh, but we can reduce this all to a single view, because we can just say, what is the kind of thing that's known? Same kind of knowledge, but what is the kind of thing known? They're saying that they're two different kinds of knowledge, not just because of the kind of thing that's known, but because of what the fuck, what is the point of the knowledge? What is the knowledge for? What is it doing for you? The knowledge is doing for you some sort of navigation of reality in the perceptual ordinary world. And the spiritual knowledge is doing something completely different, completely different. It has moral significance that's deeply different. It has self-understanding and self-knowledge differences. It's bringing about changes in you that are different. So I feel that way of looking at things leads to yet another way in which we can see the difference here. Yeah. Good. Everyone okay? Kate, you have one more? You want to follow up again, Kate?
Thank you so much. Yes, there is also a question in chat from Anna,
Okay,
and she asks me to read it vocally. So Anna has written, hello, could you please explain me if the illumination of mind is directed to outside, how this concept explains self-knowledge, how it explains reflection of thoughts, actions, self, which is placed inside.
Oh, okay, right. So this a good clarification question. I guess I forgot. I guess I didn't realize that I needed to explain this part of what's going on. So first, the clarification is that the fact that the mind can do this doesn't mean it's always doing this, right? So it can go out and illuminate something externally, but it can also do other things, right? That's the general logical point that makes it different. But then there's a specific point about manas, antakarana, and how the Advaitins think it works. So this has more to do with how this specific tradition thinks we have self-knowledge and what they think self-knowledge is. So in the Advaita tradition, which is a non-dual tradition, it's going to be the case that the self and ultimate reality are one and the same thing. They're numerically identical. And so self-knowledge can be understood in two ways. Knowledge of what the self ultimately is, substantial self-knowledge. What is the self ultimately? And then sometimes I call it attributional or attribute knowledge. Like what am I thinking right now? Or what am I hungry for right now? Or what do I want to go do next? That's about an attribute of the mind. So they have a theory of both, right? So one type of self-knowledge is like, well, what am I thinking about right now? Or what am I hungry for? And another one is, what is the self ultimately, right? So 2 points. Point number one, because the mind can go out in perception and illuminate things, doesn't mean it's always doing it, and doesn't mean it doesn't do something else differently when it's reflecting on thoughts inside. Maybe it's illuminated. There could be a different story there altogether. Number two, when we're thinking about self-knowledge, we have to distinguish, at least when you're looking at Indian philosophy, because the question of what is the self, knowledge of the self, is the most common question across Indian traditions in the philosophy of mind. However, the question, how do I know what I'm thinking right now? Or how do I know if I'm hungry? That isn't a philosophical question in Indian philosophy I've ever come across. I studied that question in analytic philosophy for years. It's a question of self-knowledge and externalism, the compatibility of externalist theories of mind and self-knowledge. That question is very common in 20th century analytic philosophy. I've never found an Indian philosopher who was interested in that question at all. They're mostly concerned with knowledge of the self. What is that thing that is the self? What is its nature, and how would I know that, right? So they have things to say about that. I'm not sure they'll have much to say about what I call attribute self-knowledge. But yes, you are correct. If it illuminates by going out in perception, what does it do in reflection? Does it illuminate internally? That's a totally legitimate question. I just don't know the details of the rest of this text on that issue. But thank you very much.
Mhm. Thank you. So probably I would come up with a continuation of my question then for a while. So yeah, considering this issue of perception, which has so much in common with understanding of knowledge, or well, so-called like basic knowledge without this complex structure, I assume that the typical question from the so-called Western tradition would be, is there any chance to differentiate then between subjectivity of human and other species, considering either animals or maybe even plants? Because so far, if I'm speaking about extended mind, am I supposed to consider that at least one mind in this structure should be a human mind? And why would I think so? As long as I can suppose that under this simple but still like including several participants system, there could be, for example, the symbiotic system, which would be extended mind, or at least would be extended perception. And in this term, it would be extended mind according to Vedanta. And this will not be any problem at all. And still, how then are there any criteria for forming a system then? Because there is a famous example from Deleuze on bee and orchid, which may be seen as forming something like together, being a symbiotic togetherness. And why are we supposed to consider the subjects as limited by the bodies with functions of their organs, which we are used to differentiate with others? This is an open question for Deleuze and ontology. So he would have this deterritorialization then, and desubjectivization. I don't know if I'm speaking it correctly. So are there any requirements on human experience or human perception or whatever there in the case of Vedanta, or this is such panpsychism which is very open towards any sort of?
Well, yeah, there's at least two parts of what you're saying I can think of. One is that in the passages I showed, I think what they're saying is basically the system that forms between the human subject, because that's the example they're talking about, and the jar, is a system for which we can use the threefold distinction between subject, instrument, and object in order to make the subject pole and the object pole. But that isn't really there, right? That's us cutting up this thing in a certain way. What's really there is a unified system that's been formed by the mind going out. But those distinctions of it being the subject and the object, those are artificial. They're just conceptual distinctions. They're not really there because it's one system. So in that sense, I think they would, I don't know a lot about Deleuze. Last time I read Deleuze, it drove me crazy. But I think from what you were saying about the symbiotic relationship between the bee and the flower, I think they would be inclined to agree that like trying to talk about what is a proper part of one thing and the other thing when it's a system between the two things is more conceptual than real. If that's the point that Deleuze is getting at in a different way, I think they're very accepting of that. And then in general, one of the things in phenomenology that is very common in alliance with Indian philosophy is that a lot of Indian philosophers, especially this tradition, not all, but this one, they like to think of the subject-object dichotomy as an artificial construction anyway. That's a lot of what they're going for. I mean, they're basically saying a lot of the times, like, these things you think that are real are totally unreal, like the subject-object dichotomy. And then, you know, Merleau-Ponty and the many phenomenologists, they love to make this point also. So in that sense, there's more unity between phenomenology and analytic and some schools of Indian philosophy, because actually in 2 weeks, I'm going to be giving a talk about this exact point you just asked about the relationship between phenomenology, subject-object dichotomy in Indian philosophy and analytic philosophy, because that is a relevant juncture point. So you were absolutely correct to bring up Deleuze in the sense that he follows the phenomenological tradition as I understand it. But the second part you asked about is an interesting question, which I have not thought about, but I'll give you the version of it that I heard. What is the theory of subjectivity when the mind is going outside of the body and connecting with objects? And so now, of course, sometimes my mind is connecting with another mind, because another mind can be an object in my visual field. So what do we need to understand about subject? And that I only thing I know is that in this tradition, subjectivity is an illusion. So the idea of subjectivity as a real phenomenon is completely false in this tradition. And they would say not only is subjecthood, being a subject, an illusion, but subjectivity itself is an illusion. If anything, it's just conceptual. So I know that they would say that, but the thing is that doesn't, in this context, that's not that satisfying to me, because I mean, we also want to explain, well, insofar as it's an illusion, how do we explain it when you're saying the mind goes out and all these things? Because you can explain why certain illusions are the way they are, right? So what is the illusion of subjectivity is kind of like the way I hear this question. And I think that's a good question, Kate. Like, I definitely think there's something going on here that should be explained in that sense. So that part I haven't thought about and I need to think about. And then the other thing you said kind of about different, I mean, they are only mentioning humans here in this tradition. I'm inclined to say that whenever Indian philosophers tend to talk about humans only, I tend to generalize to others. It's just that they weren't, I mean, that just wasn't the purview of what they were talking about. I mean, one of the things that is in common sometimes between Western philosophy and Indian philosophy is that there tends to be this way of thinking where non-human animals just don't have souls. I mean, Descartes thought this of dogs and cats and things. And in some ways, the idea is, who cares about a soul? The basic point is spiritual life is nothing a non-human animal can have. That's basically the idea. It doesn't really depend on a soul. So I tend to be like, oh, given that that was their concern, spiritual life, if we're not concerned with spiritual life, then some of the things they're saying about the mind might simply apply to non-human animals, as long as we just delete the part about spirituality, right? If we don't say that all of this is only about spiritual stuff, then it might be very well that we can say that also when a badger perceives a dam, its mind goes out, because it's giving a theory of perception. It's saying brains of a certain complexity have the capacity to form a system with other things in its environment. And that's a general idea that doesn't have to do with spirituality at all, right? We can just test and see how coherent is the idea that perception of a subject, by a subject of an object, should be best understood as the formation of a system that unifies the subject and the object as independent parts in a unified system. that's a general coherent idea. We can make it spiritual, we can make it non-spiritual, but we can definitely explore it in the case of human and non-human animals. And of course, I would say in my own current research, I'd say we can explore it in the context of artificial intelligence also. I don't think it's restricted to biological systems only.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that with the non-biological systems, that's extremely up-to-date issue now. So maybe there are any other comments or questions among our participants online here.
Oh.
There is a comment from Anna as well. I would read it aloud. So the Descartes says, the mind is light, the method is like illumination. The symbol of light is common for European and Indian philosophy, but what is difference?
Oh, okay. So I would like to answer that question. Can you send me the passages where Descartes says this, and then I will look at it and I will give you my answer. I didn't know that Descartes, I don't remember Descartes talking this way, unless you mean the stuff about clear and distinct perception in the Meditations. I mean, yeah, I need to know the citations. I mean, I read a lot of Descartes and I am very good at Descartes, but I don't remember this part. It could be true. It's just something I'm unaware of. But if it is true, then I can tell you off the top of my head one difference is that when Descartes talks about the mind, remember, he's talking about it in a substance dualist framework. And the metaphysics of Advaita Vedanta is clearly monism. If it's close to anything, it's close to Spinoza, and it's not even Spinoza. So the way in which the mind and the body is set up ontologically in Descartes will make it the case that the way in which the mind illuminates and is like light is distinct in terms of what kind of substance it is from nature. And that is not going to be the case for the Samkhya tradition of Indian philosophy. I'm writing a paper on that one also, on the Samkhya theory of artificial intelligence, to explain their view, because they don't have a substance dualism, they have a different type of view. And so there will be a difference there too. But I'm still very curious. So if you do know passages, you can just send them to me, the numbers, and I'll look it up in my Descartes books. But I would like to see what he says. I mean, I do think I remember some passages where he says the true light of reason or something like that, or I do know he uses the phrase light somewhere, but I'm not sure that, yeah, I need to see it again, and then I can tell you what the difference is. Thank you very much for bringing that to my attention. That's something I would like to learn more about.
Okay, and then, well, probably one more, like very, very brief commentary from me is concerning the way, as you just mentioned, the monism here as the ontological basis for Vedanta. I think it would be, well, at least it would be interesting to clarify a little bit whether we are then, well, talking about the real issue of time difference between different entities or not, because you gave a very, for me, a very good argument considering this issue of well, time gap or time lapse, when if I'm considering some interaction and I'm supposed to say that this is not just a coincidence, there is definitely a correlation or even a causal relation between well, something and something, or someone and whatever, like so-called subject object, which are not really subject object but still are connected, like system participants, that we in all cases can have the time difference, but still the notion of time comes to a scene then, as long as we're not really well, not really calculating time as something, well, I don't know whether this will be like so-called physical time.
No, I mean, yeah, you're right. So, I mean, one thing that you're asking here is, some of the, I mean, this is this aspect of sometimes doing philosophy, which is both exciting and troubling, which is every time you think you have kind of a clear picture of something, you realize that you can just take one thread and go infinitely deeper. So clearly the philosophy of time is going to be relevant to the time lag argument, right? That's what basically you're picking on, right? So if I now break down theories of time in terms of presentism, eternalism, or growing block theory, whatever other things, then it's going to clearly make a difference in terms of how I think about what is going on in the time lag argument. The main things that I wanted to say about the time lag argument are, one, assuming an ordinary conception of all processing being processing in time, there are two things. One, the distance argument is related to the time, the distance objection is related to the time lag objection. Because if you solve distance by quantum entanglement, then that's an instantaneous relation. If it's an instantaneous relation, there is no time lag, right? Secondly, supposing though that the relationship between the system forming between the subject and the object is instantaneous through quantum entanglement, it still could be the case that there's processing time before it becomes conscious, right? Because it's happening at one level and then it becomes a conscious perception. And there's processing time there. But processing time typically leads to, in the time lag argument, this kind of objection. Everything you know is on the basis of a process in time. Therefore, because there's a temporal delay, it could be the case that what you consciously perceive no longer exists. And there's a famous example of this. I mean, there are stars in the sky that no longer exist, whose light is still traveling towards us and we perceive. So we might be like, oh, there's a star out there, but there's no star out there because that's what the time lag argument is pointing out. So the epistemology aspect, I think, is handled by the fact that we're trying to explain ordinary, successful, unhesitating action, not how we know about distant stars. The scope of what they want to explain is far more limited, and their theories are geared towards explaining that kind of thing instead of the distant star objection. So I think when processing takes time, that's okay, because what they're looking for is not the absolute truth about what's out there, but whether or not you have the capacity to directly act in a way that would be successful without hesitation. So that's kind of how I see them related. But you're right, there is something here about the philosophy of time. So for example, in Advaita Vedanta, if I remember correctly, time also is going to be some kind of illusion. Everything's basically an illusion, because the only thing that's real is ultimate reality, which is a pure unified monistic Brahman consciousness. So given that ontology, yeah, a lot of things turn out to be either relatively real or illusions. And so, yeah, so then the time lag argument wouldn't work as easily because it would be an illusion anyway. But the way in which I was trying to deal with the objection was to understand that in this tradition, they do distinguish between ultimate reality, ordinary reality, and a higher spiritual reality. They tend to have that kind of distinction. So I was dealing with the time lag argument as if it was an objection within the ordinary reality, and therefore, what would we say about it in that situation? So I kind of geared my answer that way. But look, that's the thing about philosophy. You can get a clear picture holding certain assumptions, and then you pull on one thread, and all of a sudden it's not a clear picture.
Okay, well, I beg my pardon. So that's truly about the philosophy. What I was going to say, just I'm sorry, this was my dad calling. So
No.
yeah, maybe there are any other questions or comments.
If it's possible, when you're done with the recording, can you send it to me? Thank you.
Sure, definitely.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone. I really had an enjoyable time, and I hope people who watch this recording enjoy it and learn from it. You can feel free to contact me at my website or by email. and I'll be happy to answer any questions. And Anna, if you send me those passages on Descartes, I'll be sure to look up an answer and get back to you. And it's always wonderful to interact with my friends at Friends University in Russia all the time. So thank you very much for being kind enough to invite me and to listen to me. And I hope to hear from you all soon. And thank you once again, Kate, for organizing this. I really appreciate your help and your insight.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for giving this talk and the discussion. This is really a pleasure for me, and I'm very happy to participate as well. And if there would be any comments or questions as well, I would be happy to pass it. And yes, well, thank you everybody for your time, attention, questions, comments.
Bye, Dimitri. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anand. Yes, it's really very important.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye.
Thank you.